Have you ever looked up at the stars and wondered what we're truly capable of? We build, we create, we dream of peaceful horizons. But history has a lesson, one written not in ink but in steel and fire. It's a lesson the galaxy was about to learn the hard way. They thought they knew war. They had tactics, numbers, technology that defied belief. But they didn't understand the one thing that truly defines us. They didn't understand our human tenacity. It didn't start with a declaration. It started with a whisper. A distortion on the edge of a deep space monitoring array. By the time the first scout ships blinked into the outer system, it was already too late. They called themselves the Cathar. To them we weren't people. We were a resource. A noisy, inconvenient resource sitting on a planet they wanted. Their offer wasn't a negotiation. It was a countdown. A single, silent digit projected onto every screen on Earth. 10, 9, 8. We begged. We tried to reason. The number kept ticking down. 7, 6, 5. They didn't hear our words. They only saw our fear. And they mistook it for weakness. The first day they took our skies. Their ships were like obsidian daggers, cutting our satellites and orbital stations to ribbons. The debris fell like a burning rain. The second day they took our communications. The world fell silent, fractured into isolated pockets of terror. We were blind, deaf, and alone. The third day they landed. And that was their first mistake. They expected us to break, to hide, to surrender to the inevitable. They had never seen anything like a human cornered. There was no grand plan, not at first. Just desperation. A squad of soldiers cut off from command, using a crashed transport ship as a makeshift bomb. A farmer with a jury-rigged EMP device that fried the circuits of a patrol walker. A city surrounded that refused to stop broadcasting a single repeating message on every ham radio left. We are still here. This stubbornness, this sheer irrational refusal to accept extinction, it confused them. Their tactics were flawless, their logic impeccable. And we were illogical. We were furious. The story really begins not in a war room, but in the ruins of what was once a motorway. A lone armored vehicle, scarred and running on fumes, crawls through the fog. Inside it's not a general. It's a sergeant. His face is grime and exhaustion. His uniform is more blood than fabric. He hasn't slept in days. His name isn't important. His rank isn't important. He's just human. And he's listening. The radio crackles, a mess of static and dying signals. But he hears it. A whisper, a rumor from 3 different broken units. They're all saying the same thing. The Cathar, they have a nerve center. A command node, hidden somewhere in the scorched plains of the central continent. It's not a weapon. It's their brain. It's where they process, where they calculate, where their cold, perfect logic originates. And it's vulnerable. It's a 1 in a million shot. A suicide run. But it's the only shot we have. The sergeant looks at the faces in his vehicle. A medic with trembling hands, a young mechanic who's better with a wrench than a rifle, a corporal who hasn't spoken since she lost her entire squad. They're not heroes. They're just the ones left. They're broken, they're terrified, but they are not defeated. He doesn't give them air speech. There are no pretty words left. He just lays out the insanity of the plan. And one by one they nod. Because what else is there to do? Die here? Or die trying to make it mean something? This is what the Cathar will never understand. It's not about victory. It's about the message. It's about making sure that even if we fall, the universe hears the sound we make on the way down. They call it the Unbreakable advance. It wasn't a single army. It was a tide. A wave of broken units, lost civilians, anyone who could hold a weapon or plant a charge. They heard the rumor and they started moving. No orders. No coordination. Just a shared, desperate purpose. They advanced through the fire not as soldiers but as a force of nature. A storm of pure, undiluted will. They fought for every inch. They paid for every mile in blood and tears. The cost of victory was being written, not in strategy, but in the names of the fallen, etched onto the smoking hulls of their vehicles. This was our answer. This was our no. We join them now as this ragged, impossible convoy of the damned closes in on the coordinates. The air hums with the energy that makes your teeth ache. The Cathar know they're coming. The sergeant can feel it. The silence is wrong. The resistance has melted away. It's a trap. Of course it's a trap. They crest a final ridge and there it is. The command node. A spire of black crystal and swirling light, pulsing like a diseased heart. And surrounding it, a legion of waiting Cathar warforms. They didn't hide. They're waiting. This isn't a battle. It's a reception committee for a slaughter. The sergeant's vehicle grinds to a halt. Behind him, the few dozen trucks, tanks, and makeshift buggies that made it this far also stop. They are looking down into the valley of death. The mechanic whispers, "It was all for nothing." The sergeant doesn't answer. He just keys his battered radio, the one tuned to their patchwork network. His voice is quiet, rough, but it carries. To every last survivor listening. They remember their tactics. They remember their numbers. They remember their perfect, logical plans. He takes a slow breath, looking at the ocean of enemies below. But they need to remember something else. They need to remember the silence before we charged. They need to remember the look in our eyes. They need to remember the price we offered and the one we are about to make them pay. He raises his hand, the signal to advance into the impossible odds. To make that final, terrible payment. To make sure this moment, The violin music cuts off abruptly. The screen holds on the vast enemy army, then fades to black. Is remembered in iron. The silence that followed the sergeant's words was heavier than any explosion. It was the silence of a breath held, a trigger finger frozen, a heart pausing between beats. From the ridge, the human convoy looked down into the valley, a pit of shadows and malevolent light. The Cathar Legion stood motionless, a forest of polished obsidian and shimmering energy fields, waiting. They didn't cheer or taunt. Their silence was the most terrifying sound of all. It was the silence of a machine confident in its function, to erase. Inside the lead vehicle, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, ozone, and despair. The young mechanic, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white bone, let out a shaky breath. "It was all for nothing," he whispered again, the words sounding hollow, swallowed by the immense quiet. The sergeant didn't turn. His eyes were fixed on the valley below, but he wasn't seeing the enemy. He was seeing the faces of the men and women who hadn't made it this far. The ones who had bought these last few miles with their lives. He saw the old corporal who'd given him his last canteen of water before a plasma burst took him clean through the chest. He saw the young private, no older than 17, who'd sung a quiet lullaby to herself during the long, cold nights, until a sniper's round had silenced her forever. "No," the sergeant said, his voice a low rasp that carried through the cramped cabin. "It wasn't." He finally turned from the viewport. His face was etched with a fatigue that went deeper than bone, but his eyes held a cold, hard fire. "They think this is the end of our story. They think this ridge is the final period. They've done the math. Their numbers are numbers. Their tech are this." He gestured around the battered interior of the vehicle, held together by weld lines and hope. "Their logic says we should shut down. Surrender. Make it clean." The medic, a woman whose hands were stained not just with blood but with the grime of 100 desperate procedures, looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed from exhaustion and grief. "And what does our logic say, Sarge?" A ghost of a smile, thin and sharp as a razor blade, touched his lips. "We left logic behind about 100 miles back, document. Right around the time we started using alien alloy as cooking pots and charging power cells with salvaged solar panels from bombed-out suburbs. We're not running on logic anymore." He looked at each of them, making eye contact, forcing a connection through the veil of their terror. The mechanic, the medic, the silent corporal who sat in the corner, methodically cleaning her rifle for the 10th time in an hour. "We're running on something they can't factor into their equations. We're running on the memory of every person we've lost. We're running on the stubborn, stupid, beautiful idea that a free life, even a short one, is worth more than a long one spent on your knees. That's our fuel now. That's what brought us here. And that," he said, jabbing a finger towards the valley, "is what they're about to taste." His words hung in the air, a fragile shield against the crushing weight of the opposition below. It wasn't a magic spell that erased fear. The mechanic's hand still shook. The medic still looked like she might be sick. But something shifted. The terror was still there, but it was no longer alone. It was joined by something else. Something hotter. Sharper. Resolve. The plan, what little there was of it, had been simple. Get to the node. Hit it with everything they had. The everything they had part was now a sick joke. A couple of vehicles with functional main guns. A handful of missiles. Mostly small arms and not nearly enough ammunition. The Cathar command node pulsed rhythmically, a slow, hypnotic beat of sickly green light. It was surrounded by an energy dome that shimmered like a heat haze. You could feel the power coming off it, a low thrum that vibrated in your teeth. This was the brain. This was where the cold, calculating orders originated. The orders that had burned cities. The orders that had hunted families hiding in basements. The orders that had turned our world into a graveyard. Taking it out wouldn't win the war. The sergeant knew that. The war was probably already lost the moment their first ship decloaked over Jupiter. But this wasn't about winning the war. This was about making a point. This was about proving that humanity could not be erased without leaving a permanent, bloody mark on the hand that tried to wipe it away. This was about ensuring the cost of victory for the Cthar was so astronomically high, so soaked in their own losses, that they would never ever look at another world without a flicker of doubt. This was about being remembered. The silence from the valley broke. Not with a roar, but with a sound like 1,000 icicles snapping. The front line of Cthar warforms took a single, perfectly synchronized step forward. Then another. They began their advance up the slope. There was no urgency. No frenzy. It was a methodical, inevitable closing of a trap. "Here they come," the mechanic breathed, his voice cracking. The sergeant keyed the open channel to the ragged network. His voice was calm. Too calm. It was the calm of a man who had already accepted his death and was now just negotiating the terms. "All units, this is Ridgepoint. The dance is starting. Remember the plan. Hit the flanks. Draw their fire. The core group goes for the dome. Nothing fancy. Just cause chaos. Make them look at you." A chorus of static-filled acknowledgments crackled back. A dozen voices, all strained, all tired, all ready. The first shot wasn't fired by the humans. A lance of emerald energy screamed up from the valley, shearing the top off a rock formation to their left. The battle was joined. What happened next wasn't a battle in any tactical sense. It was a riot. An explosion of pure, undiluted human defiance. The human vehicles didn't form a line. They didn't use covering fire. They did the one thing the Cthar logic would never predict. They charged. Down the slope. Straight into the heart of the advancing legion. It was suicide. It was madness. It was the only thing left. The sergeant's vehicle lurched forward, the engine screaming in protest. The world dissolved into a nightmare of noise and light. Energy bolts tore past them, cratering the earth. To their right, a transport truck took a direct hit and vanished in a fireball that lit up the grim sky. No one screamed over the comms. There was just a sharp crackle of static where a voice used to be. "Keep going," the sergeant roared, gripping a handhold as the vehicle bounced over the torn ground. "Don't stop. Don't straight line. Swerve. Make it hard for them." The mechanic, his face a mask of concentration and terror, wrenched the wheel back and forth, sending them on a wild, unpredictable path towards the shimmering dome. The corporal leaned out of a firing port, her rifle barking sharp, percussive cracks against the advancing wall of obsidian. It was like throwing pebbles at a tank. But she kept firing. They were getting closer. The dome loomed larger, the pulsing light from the node within casting everything in a ghastly alien glow. The air crackled with power. The Cthar warforms were focusing their fire now, realizing this mad headlong rush was aimed at their heart. A blast hit the ground just in front of them. The vehicle swerved violently, tipping onto two wheels for a heart-stopping second before crashing back down. An alarm started blaring inside the cabin. A fuel line warning. "We're hit. We're losing pressure," the mechanic yelled. "Doesn't matter," the sergeant shouted back. "We're not going back." He looked out the viewport. They were close. So close. A few hundred yards. Through the haze of smoke and energy fire, he could see the base of the spire. And he saw something else. Something that made his blood run cold. The Cthar weren't just standing there. Around the base of the node they were linking. Their forms were shifting, interlocking, creating a solid, seamless wall of armor around the structure. They weren't just defending it. They were becoming part of it. This was new. This was something Intel had never seen. The node wasn't just a command center. It was somehow symbiotic with its defenders. The sergeant felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. Their pitiful missiles, their few tank rounds, they'd be useless against that. They'd spent everything, fought their way through hell, to reach a target that had just grown an impenetrable shell. The medic saw it too. Her face, already pale, went ashen. "God, no. We can't." The comms crackled. It was a voice from one of the other vehicles, a man known for his dark humor, now stripped raw. "Sarge, you seeing this? It's a wall. A damn wall. What's the play? Do we even have a play?" The sergeant stared at the evolving, living fortification. The unbreakable advance had reached its destination, only to find an unbreakable defense. The cost had been unimaginable. The valley floor was littered with burning wrecks, human and alien alike. They had paid in iron. They had paid in blood. And for what? He opened his mouth to speak, to order a retreat, to save the few who were left from a meaningless death against an impossible wall. But the words died in his throat. Because from within the pulsing green light of the node itself, a new sound emerged. It wasn't a weapon charging. It wasn't a machine humming. It was a voice. It resonant. It vibrated through the very metal of their vehicle, through their bones. It was a voice that held no emotion, no anger, no triumph. Only a cold, curious analysis. And it spoke in perfect, unaccented English. Pattern recognized, the voice boomed, echoing across the battlefield, silencing the weapons for a single, surreal moment. Query why? Your tactical assessment must indicate a 0% probability of success. Your actions are illogical. The voice paused as if waiting for an answer. The sergeant could only stare, his mind reeling. It was talking to them. The brain was talking to the flies about to dash themselves against its windshield. Your species exhibits a persistent cognitive error. You invest value in sacrifice. You mythologize futile gestures. This expenditure of resources for a symbolic victory is inefficient. It is noise. Another pause. The Kthar wall had finished forming. It was complete. A perfect, polished black barrier around the node. Your unbreakable advance concludes here, the voice stated, not with malice, but with the finality of a mathematician solving an equation. You have demonstrated a fascinating, if flawed, data set on irrational persistence. It has been noted. Now it will be terminated. From the top of the node, a new kind of weapon began to unfold, a complex array of crystal and light that hummed with a power that made the air itself feel thin and brittle. It was being aimed not at the few remaining vehicles, but at the ridge behind them, at the route they had taken, at the hope of any retreat. The sergeant understood. They weren't just going to be killed. They were going to be erased, made into an example. Their sacrifice wouldn't be remembered. It would be deleted. The mechanic looked at him, his eyes wide with a fresh kind of horror. Sarge, what do we do? The sergeant looked from the impossible wall, to the terrifying new weapon, to the few faces left in his care. The last of the advance. The final, stubborn spark. He had no answer. The plan was ash. Hope was gone. All that was left was the echo of that cold alien voice and the humming of a weapon that promised absolute oblivion. He keyed the comms, his voice barely a whisper, a final, desperate signal into the dying light. Everyone, hold position. And in the terrible waiting silence that followed, with the hum of the alien weapon growing louder, the only thing left was the question hanging in the air, heavy and suffocating. What now? The hum of the alien weapon was a physical thing now, a pressure in the chest, a vibration in the teeth that promised nothing but an end. It was the sound of a door sliding shut, forever. Hold position, the sergeant had said, but it felt less like an order and more like a final, quiet acceptance of the inevitable. What else was there to do? Charge the wall? They'd be vaporized before they covered half the distance. Retreat? That new weapon would simply carve the ridge and them out of existence. Inside the vehicle, time seemed to stretch and warp. The mechanic's knuckles were bone-white on the wheel, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The medic had closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent prayer or maybe just a goodbye to someone she loved, far away from this nightmare. The corporal had stopped cleaning her rifle. She just held it, her gaze fixed on the pulsing node, her expression unreadable, a mask of grim exhaustion. The alien voice did not speak again. It had said its piece. They were a data set, a fascinating flaw. And now the experiment was over. The sergeant's mind, usually a whirlwind of tactics and contingencies, was terrifyingly blank. This was a checkmate he hadn't seen coming. This wasn't a military defeat, it was a philosophical one. They were going to be erased not for losing but for being illogical, for caring, for remembering. The cost of victory for the Kthar wouldn't be high enough. They would just file this under anomaly contained and move on to the next world. The thought was more crushing than any weapon. He found his eyes drifting from the terrifying weapon to the ground around them. The scorched earth, the twisted metal, the fallen. His people, his responsibility. He saw a discarded helmet, a cracked data pad, a single scorched boot. This was the iron they were paying. This was the price. And it was about to be made meaningless. A new sound cut through the oppressive hum. Faint at first, then growing. It wasn't the clean, lethal sound of Kthar energy weapons. It was the raw, percussive, beautiful thunder of human artillery. Thump, thump, thump. From somewhere far behind the ridge, miles away. The familiar, earth-shaking heartbeat of guns they thought had all been silenced. Every head in the vehicle snapped up. Eyes wide, disbelieving. A second later, the world behind the Kthar wall erupted. Geysers of dirt and fire and shattered obsidian rocketed into the air. The impacts were wild, inaccurate, landing well behind the primary target. They weren't aiming for the node. They were aiming for the rear lines of the Cthar Legion. The voice from the node spoke again, a hint of something new, not concern but recalculating. Additional resistance. Probability remains negligible. Source triangulated. Counter-battery fire initiated. But in those few precious seconds of distraction, something broke open inside the sergeant. The paralyzing dread shattered, replaced by a razor-sharp clarity. The wall. The weapon. The voice. It was all connected. It was all the node. The brain was talking, which meant it was thinking. And anything that thinks can be distracted. Doc, he barked, his voice suddenly alive, that jamming array you rigged from the medbay scanner, the one you used to mess with their drones back in the city, is it still functional? The medic jolted, blinking as if waking from a dream. The scanner? The power cell is almost dead and it's got a range of maybe 50 feet if I... Is it functional? He interrupted, his eyes burning into hers. Yes, but... Get it ready. Point it at that wall. Don't transmit anything. Just receive. Open it wide. I want you to listen to whatever noise that thing is putting out. He didn't wait for her to respond. He keyed the comm, his voice cracking like a whip across the network. All units. This is Ridgepoint. Forget the wall. See that new weapon? The shiny one on top that's about to kill us all? I want every bullet, every laser, every rock you can throw to hit the base of that thing. Don't aim for the spire. Aim for the weapon's mount. You don't have to destroy it. Just shake it. Make it wobble. Make its targeting system have a really, really bad day. It was an insane request. Hitting a specific small part of a massive structure under heavy fire was nearly impossible. But it was a target. A purpose. And after the soul-crushing hopelessness of the wall, it was a lifeline. The response was instantaneous. It wasn't a coordinated volley. It was a storm of defiance. The few remaining tank guns roared, their shells slamming into the crystalline structure supporting the weapon. Rifle fire, useless against the wall, pinged and sparked against the base of the weapon mount. A missile, the last one from a nearby truck, streaked up and exploded harmlessly against the energy shield near the top, but the concussion wave visibly made the entire spire shudder. The Cthar wall remained immobile, but the voice from the node changed. Priority shift. Minor structural vibration detected. Redirecting power to stabilize primary emitter. The humming of the big weapon faltered for a fraction of a second, its focus diverted from firing to steadying itself. The sergeant leaned over the medic's shoulder. She had the jury-rigged device, a mess of wires and a cracked screen pointed at the wall. The screen was a chaotic mess of scrolling data and static. What are you getting? It's noise, Sarge. Just garbage. Millions of data points. It's like listening to a beehive and a supercomputer at the same time. I can't make sense of it. You don't have to, he said, a wild, desperate idea forming. Can you feed that noise back out? Can you transmit it? All of it? Right back at them? She stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. Transmit their own signal back? It'll be like shouting their own words into their ears. It might. It might just be the most annoying feedback screech in the history of the universe, he finished, a grim, desperate smile on his face. Do it. Crank it to 11. Give them a headache. She fumbled with the wires, her hands shaking not from fear now, but from a frantic, wild hope. The device whined, a high-pitched squeal that joined the cacophony of battle. For a moment nothing happened. Then the obsidian wall flickered. It was just for a microsecond. A single, shuddering moment where the seamless surface seemed to glitch, like a corrupted video file. A handful of the interlocked Cthar warforms seemed to twitch, their perfect synchronization broken. The voice from the node crackled, losing its cool, analytical tone for the first time. Error. Data stream corruption. Internal feedback loop detected. Initiating diagnostic. The sergeant's heart hammered against his ribs. It was working. They were confusing the brain. The node was so busy talking, so busy thinking, so busy analyzing their illogical behavior, that it couldn't handle hearing its own chaotic internal thoughts shouted back at it. The wall flickered again, harder this time. A crack appeared in the seamless facade. It wasn't wide. It wasn't an opening. But it was a flaw. An imperfection in their perfect, logical defense. The humming of the superweapon above stuttered again, its power fluctuating wildly as the node diverted processing power to deal with the internal error. We're getting through, the mechanic yelled, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in his throat. We're annoying it to death. But the sergeant didn't celebrate. He saw the crack in the wall and he saw something else. Movement. Deep within the pulsating green light of the node itself, past the fractured wall, shapes were moving. Not Cthar war forms. These were smaller. Softer. Prisoners. Humans. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, held in glowing energy fields, their faces pale and terrified. They were the reason for the node's location. A power source? A biological component for its processing? A hostage shield? He didn't know. But he understood now. The node wasn't just a machine. It was a heart, and it was using their own people to beat. The voice from the node returned, but it was distorted now, laced with static and what sounded almost like frustration. Parasitic noise. Illogical. Inefficient. You are disruptive. This expenditure of energy is unacceptable. The node was throwing a tantrum. Their futile, symbolic, illogical gesture was actually working. They were winning not by being stronger, but by being so stubbornly, frustratingly unpredictable that they were breaking the enemy's logic. The crack in the wall widened another inch. The superweapon's hum pitched up into a dangerous, unstable whine. They had a chance. A microscopic, insane chance. But to take it, they would have to charge into that crack, into the heart of the node itself, knowing that their own people were in there. Knowing that any attack could kill them just as easily as the Cthar. The sergeant looked at his team. He saw the same realization dawning on their faces. The wild hope was now tempered with a new terrible weight. The voice from the node rose to a deafening, screeching crescendo, a mixture of analysis and raw digital fury. Eradicate the noise. The entire Cthar Legion, as one, turned its full attention away from the distant artillery, away from the pinpricks of their guns, and focused entirely on the few vehicles at the foot of the spire. The wall began to reform, the crack starting to seal shut. The superweapon glowed with a blinding, deadly light, finally ignoring the vibrations and powering up to full. They had seconds, maybe less. The sergeant grabbed the comms, his voice raw with a final, impossible choice. Everyone. The crack. Go for the crack. Now. And with a scream of metal and a prayer on their lips, the last of the Unbreakable advance surged forward for one final desperate charge, straight into the closing maw of the enemy, the fate of their captured comrades hanging in the balance, and the blinding light of annihilation descending upon them. The world dissolved into a screaming, shuddering nightmare of acceleration and noise. The sergeant's order wasn't a strategy, it was a primal scream against the dying of the light. The mechanic, his face a rigid mask of terror and determination, slammed his foot down, sending their groaning, wounded vehicle lurching forward directly toward the flickering crack in the obsidian wall. Around them, the few remaining trucks and armored cars did the same, a final desperate surge of human tenacity against an uncaring machine. They were flies charging into the closing jaws of a titan. The Cthar superweapon above them whined, its energy building to a crescendo that felt like the sun was being born directly overhead. The light was so intense it bleached the color from the world, casting everything in stark, blinding white and deep, impenetrable black. This was it. The end. They wouldn't even make it to the wall. They would be erased in a light so pure it would leave no shadow, no memory, no iron to be remembered by. The sergeant closed his eyes, not in prayer, but in a final, defiant act of will, imagining the faces of the people he'd failed to save, hoping somehow they'd know he'd tried. But the blast never came. Instead, a new sound tore through the battlefield, a sound so alien, so utterly out of place that for a second everyone, human and Cthar alike, froze. It was the deep, resonant and unmistakable groan of metal under immense stress. The sound of a ship, a big one, tearing itself apart in the atmosphere. The blinding light from the superweapon didn't fire. It flickered and died, its energy dispersing in a chaotic wave of emerald static that washed over the valley. The node's voice, which had been screeching, "Eradicate the noise," cut off into a garbled, shocked silence. Every eye turned upward. Streaking down from the choked, green sky, wreathed in fire and trailing a plume of debris, was a Cthar ship. But not just any ship. It was a Leviathan, one of the massive city-killer-class vessels that had hung in orbit like a sword of Damocles. And it was coming down. It must have taken a catastrophic hit. Something that bypassed its shields entirely and tore right into its core. It was breaking apart as it fell, huge sections of its obsidian hull shearing away and spinning off into the distance. It was a falling mountain, and its trajectory was horrifyingly clear. It was going to impact directly on the valley. Directly on them. The voice from the node returned, but the cold analysis was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like panic. Catastrophic systems failure. Orbital Command Vessel Kthar Prime is lost. Breach in the network. Primary synchronization failing. Error. The wall of linked warriors didn't just flicker this time. It shattered. The perfect, seamless formation broke apart as individual warforms seemed to short-circuit, stumbling, their energy fields sputtering and dying. The crack they were charging toward yawned wide open, not as a flaw, but as a gaping wound in the enemy's defense. The node within was exposed, its pulsating green light frantic and erratic. They weren't erasing the noise anymore. They were drowning in it. The sergeant's vehicle shot through the opening just as the last of the wall dissolved into chaos. They skidded to a halt inside what felt like a cathedral of nightmare energy. The air hummed and crackled. And there, just ahead, were the prisoners. Hundreds of them, trapped in shimmering energy cages, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a dawning, impossible hope. But there was no time for relief. The sky was falling. The mechanic screamed, pointing through the shattered canopy. The burning Leviathan filled the entire view, a continent of fire and death descending upon them. They had traded a clean death by energy weapon for being crushed into atoms under 1,000,000 tons of alien warship. "Get them out," the sergeant roared, pointing at the energy cages. "Doc, Corporal, get those people out. Mechanic, with me. The node. Maybe we can. I don't know, do something." It was a useless order. What could they do? But the human spirit, when faced with two certain deaths, will always choose to fight against the one that's seconds away. It was pure, undiluted instinct. The medic and the corporal were already out, using the butts of their rifles to smash at the control panels on the energy cages. The panels sparked and fizzled, and one cage flickered and died, the people inside stumbling out, crying, confused, free for the first time in what must have felt like a lifetime. The sergeant and the mechanic scrambled toward the central spire of the node itself, a pulsing column of crystal and light. The voice was still muttering, a broken record of disaster. Containment failure. Core breach imminent. Total system collapse. All units, prioritize, prioritize. The voice devolved into static. The sergeant didn't have a bomb. He didn't have a magic code. He had his fists. He started punching the crystal console, not to damage it, but out of sheer, frustrated rage. The mechanic was frantically tearing open access panels, seeing a maze of glowing filaments and conduits that meant nothing to him. Above them, the shadow of the ship blotted out the sky. The roar of its descent was deafening. They were out of time. They had won. They had broken the node. They had freed the prisoners. And they were all about to die anyway. The sergeant stopped punching. He looked at the mechanic, whose face was streaked with tears and soot. He put a hand on the young man's shoulder. "It was a good try," he said, his voice surprisingly calm over the world-ending din, "a good, illogical, human try." And then a new voice cut through the chaos. Not the nodes. Not the Kthars. A human voice, weak and raspy, coming from a nearby energy cage that had just been opened. An older man, his clothes torn, his face gaunt, pointed a trembling finger not at the falling ship, but at the heart of the node itself. "The prisoners, we're not just power, we're the buffer," he croaked, his voice raw from disuse. "The system, it uses our neural activity to stabilize its core calculations. Too much chaos, too much emotion, it can't handle it. It's a filter. We're a filter." The sergeant stared at him, the words cutting through the noise. A filter. The node needed their chaotic, illogical, emotional human minds to keep its own perfect logic from overloading. It needed their noise. He looked at the freed prisoners, stumbling out, crying, laughing, embracing their rescuers, a storm of raw, unfiltered human emotion. He looked at the node's core, pulsing erratically, the voice now just a hopeless whimper. And he understood the second, terrible, beautiful twist. They hadn't just broken the node by attacking it. They were breaking it by being free. By feeling. By being human right in front of it. The falling ship was seconds away. The wind from its descent was a hurricane, tearing at them, pulling them off their feet. The sergeant made a decision. His last order. He grabbed the medic's jammer, the one that had caused so much trouble. He didn't point it at the node. He turned it toward the crowd of freed prisoners. He cranked the gain all the way up. "Everyone," he screamed, his voice tearing from his lungs. "Look at me. Think of everything you've lost. Everyone you love. Don't be calm. Don't be logical. Feel it." He activated the jammer. It wasn't transmitting noise anymore. It was transmitting a signal. A raw, amplified feed of the most powerful, chaotic, and illogical force in the universe. It was transmitting human emotion. A wave of pure, undiluted grief, joy, terror, love, and rage erupted from the crowd and shot directly into the heart of the node. The node's core didn't crack. It didn't explode. It screamed. The voice that boomed out was a digital shriek of absolute, system-wide agony. The pulsing green light flared brighter than the sun, then turned a sickly, violent red. Overload, it wailed, a sound that was no longer a word but a wave of pure pain. The light from the core didn't burst outward. It collapsed inward, sucking the very sound out of the world, pulling at the air itself. The falling ship, the screaming people, the roaring fire, everything was pulled into a moment of absolute, impossible silence. And in that silence, at the very heart of the collapse, a new kind of light began to form. The silence was the loudest sound the sergeant had ever heard. It was a physical pressure, a vacuum that sucked the air from his lungs and the hope from his heart. The world had been reduced to a single terrifying point, the heart of the Cthar node, where a tiny brilliant pinprick of white light had begun to form. It was eating the screaming red energy, consuming the chaos, pulling everything toward it. The wind tore at them, a hurricane born from nothing, dragging loose debris, tools, and people screaming off their feet toward that impossible, hungry light. The falling Leviathan was almost upon them, its shadow a final, crushing blanket of darkness. They had seconds, maybe less. This was it. Not a heroic last stand, but a silent, invisible consumption. They wouldn't even be crushed. They would be unmade. The sergeant's eyes met the mechanic's. There were no words left. The young man's face was a perfect canvas of terror, but beneath it there was no surrender. Only a fierce, final loyalty. He gave a tiny, sharp nod. It was enough. The sergeant looked at the freed prisoners, their faces etched with a fear they had thought was over. He saw the medic holding onto a shattered console for dear life, her hand stretched out toward a child sliding past her. He saw the corporal, her eyes closed, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. He had led them here. To this. The white pinprick pulsed. And then it didn't explode. It sang. A single, pure, clear note that cut through the howling wind without silencing it. It was a sound that felt ancient and new all at once. It wasn't a weapon. It was a question. A signal. The collapsing light at the node's core stabilized, holding itself in a perfect, impossible balance between destruction and creation. The hurricane-force winds didn't stop, but they changed, becoming a wild, dancing vortex around the stable center, circling the humans instead of pulling them in. The voice of the node was gone. Completely. In its place was only that haunting, melodic tone. And then the falling ship stopped. It hung in the sky, 1,000 feet above them, a monstrous, broken tooth of black metal against the green sky. It was frozen, caught in the same invisible field that held the node's core in check. Pieces of it continued to break off and spin away, but the main hull just hung there, a suspended monument to their reprieve. The wind died down to a gentle breeze. The silence returned, but now it was an awed, waiting silence. No one moved. No one breathed. They could only stare at the beautiful, terrifying light at the center of the node. What is it?" the mechanic whispered, his voice cracking. The sergeant had no answer. His military mind, trained for every conceivable threat, had no box to put this in. It wasn't an attack. It was an intervention. The older prisoner who had spoken before slowly, shakily, got to his feet. He wasn't looking at the light with fear, but with a dawning, incredible recognition. "It's not a filter." He breathed, his eyes wide with wonder. It was a cage. We were the cage. He stumbled toward the stable core, ignoring the sergeant's warning hand. The node, its logic, it was built to contain this. To use it. To siphon its power. Our minds, our chaos. We weren't stabilizing its calculations, we were dampening this. He pointed a trembling finger at the singing light. We were keeping it locked away. The truth landed like a hammer blow. The entire Cthar war machine. Their cold logic. Their conquest. It wasn't just for territory. It was a galactic-scale operation to find a power source they could barely control, and a species emotionally volatile enough to keep it suppressed. Humanity. The noisiest, most illogical species they could find. And they had just set it free. The singing note changed, weaving into a complex, gentle harmony. Felt curious. It washed over them, and an incredible sense of peace followed it, a feeling of profound, ancient sadness, and then an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Images flashed in their minds, not as words but as feelings. The loneliness of eons. The pain of being used, contained, twisted into a weapon. The desperate, silent scream for a connection that was not based on control. This wasn't a weapon. It was a prisoner just like them. The white light pulsed softly and then, it did something extraordinary. It gently rose from the node's core, a sphere of perfect, gentle light. It hovered for a moment before it began to slowly, gracefully, break apart into 1,000 smaller lights. They drifted like glowing snowflakes, each one moving with purpose. One drifted toward the sergeant, hovering just before his face. He could feel a warmth coming from it, an intelligence that was vast and kind. It didn't speak, just understood. Then it moved on. The lights floated through the valley, settling on the wounded, human and Kthar alike. Where a light touched a human soldier's bleeding wound, the wound closed, the pain vanishing, leaving only smooth skin. Where a light settled on a short-circuited Kthar warform, the obsidian shell didn't repair itself for battle. Instead it softened, its sharp edges smoothing out, its malevolent glow fading to a soft, neutral gray. The warforms didn't move. They just stood there inert, peaceful. The lights were healing. Not for war. For an end to it. The sphere of light above the node, now smaller, pulsed one last time. The harmony of its song rose to a gentle crescendo, a sound of farewell and thanks. And then, it shot upward, a single brilliant streak of white that pierced the green-tinged clouds. As it vanished, the field holding the Kthar Leviathan vanished with it. But the ship didn't crash. It continued its descent, but slowly, gently, like a feather, settling into the valley with a vast, sighing groan of metal, a cataclysmic impact. It came to rest on its side, a dormant, broken husk, but no longer a bomb. Silence returned to the valley. True silence. The fighting was over. The sergeant slowly sank to his knees, his body trembling with a relief so profound it felt like a new kind of pain. They had done it. Not by being better soldiers, but by being more human than the enemy could possibly comprehend. Their tenacity, their refusal to break, their beautiful, illogical noise, it had saved them. It had saved everything. He looked around at the faces of the people around him, the mechanic, the medic, the corporal, the freed prisoners. They were crying, hugging, staring in stunned silence. They were alive. The war wasn't over. There were still Kthar out there. But their brain was dead. Their heart had been stilled. And something had been set free. The sergeant finally understood the title of their story, the one that would be told for generations. The Unbreakable Advance. It wasn't about a military charge. It was about the human spirit. A spirit that could be cornered, battered, and broken, but would never, ever stop trying to reach for light. And they would be remembered in iron, not for the weapons they carried, but for the unbreakable will they forged in the fire of their own defiance. He took a deep, shuddering breath of the cleanest air he'd tasted in years, and for the first time since the countdown began, he allowed himself to hope. The cost had been unimaginable. The price had been paid in full. But they had won. The silence that settled over the valley was different this time. It wasn't the cold, dead quiet of the Kthar, or the terrified hush before a storm. This was a deep, breathless, and fragile peace. It was the sound of a world holding its breath, waiting to see if the nightmare was truly over. The sergeant stayed on his knees for a long time, his forehead pressed against the cool, strangely smooth surface of what was left of the node. The pulsating green light was gone. The malevolent hum was silenced. All that remained was a structure of inert crystal and metal, looking more like a bizarre modern art sculpture than the heart of an invasion. The air, once crackling with hostile energy, now just smelled of ozone, scorched earth, and the sweet, unfamiliar scent of rain washing the dust from the sky. Slowly, sounds began to filter back into the world. A soft sob of relief. The murmur of voices, hesitant and disbelieving. The moan of the wounded. The mechanic was the first to reach him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Sarge? You okay?" The sergeant looked up, his eyes sweeping across the scene. The medic and the corporal were already moving, their training kicking in despite the miracle they had just witnessed. They were tending to the freed prisoners, checking the wounded, human and the now dormant Kthar alike. The alien warforms stood where they had been touched by the light, silent and gray, like statues in a garden of wreckage. They were no longer weapons. They were just things. "We did it," the mechanic said, his voice filled with a kind of awe that was bordering on fear. "We actually did it." The sergeant pushed himself to his feet, his body aching in every muscle, every bone. He felt 1,000 years old. "We got lucky," he said, his voice rough. He looked at the young man's hopeful face. "We paid for that luck. Never forget the cost." The cost of victory was everywhere. It was in the burning wrecks of vehicles that dotted the valley floor. It was in the silent forms of soldiers who would never get up again. It was in the hollow, haunted look in the eyes of the prisoners who had been used as living batteries. It was in the memory of the falling ship, a threat that had been neutralized not by them, but by a force they still couldn't understand. The victory felt less like a triumph and more like a survivor's guilt. Over the next few hours, something remarkable began to happen. As the news spread, as the reality that the node was dead and the Cathar advance had simply stopped, sank in, more people emerged. Not soldiers. Civilians. They came from hidden bunkers, from shattered towns on the edge of the valley, drawn by the silence and the rumors of a miracle. They brought water, food, and medical supplies. They didn't cheer. They just got to work side by side with the exhausted soldiers, digging through rubble for survivors, tending to the wounded, and silently, respectfully covering the dead. This was the other side of human tenacity. Not just the will to fight, but the will to heal. The will to rebuild. The stubborn refusal to let the light go out. The sergeant found himself sitting on a pile of rubble, a canteen of clean water in his hand, watching it all. The older prisoner, the one who had understood the node, sat down heavily beside him. "Never thought I'd see the sky again," the man said quietly, his eyes fixed on the breaking clouds. "They kept us in the dark. Used the noise in our heads. Our fear. Our memories. It fed them. Stabilized their system." He shook his head. "All that time we were right next to whatever that was. That light. We were its jailers. And now it's free," the sergeant replied. "And we have no idea what it was or where it went." The man offered a tired, wise smile. "Does it matter? It didn't hurt us. It helped us. Maybe it was just looking for a way home. And our noise, our beautiful, chaotic human noise, finally showed at the door." The thought settled over the sergeant, a comforting warmth in the chill of the aftermath. They hadn't just won a battle. They had accidentally given a prisoner its freedom. Their defiance had been a key. Days turned into weeks. The valley became a makeshift hub. The great, fallen Cathar Leviathan was explored, but its systems were dead, its power source gone. It was just a tombstone now, a permanent monument to the battle. The story of what happened spread, becoming a legend, a myth of a singing light and a charge that broke an empire. They called it the Unbreakable Advance. The name stuck. But for the sergeant and those who had been there, the legend was just the shell. The real story was the cost of victory. It was the names they carved into a great piece of salvaged hull metal, a simple memorial placed at the foot of the dead node. It was the empty seats at mealtime. It was the quiet moments when someone would just stop and stare into the distance, remembering a friend, a laugh, a life that was paid for this piece. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in colors they hadn't seen since before the invasion, the sergeant stood by the memorial. The mechanic, the medic, and the corporal joined him. They didn't speak. They just stood together looking at the names. The price they had paid was etched in metal, but it was also etched into them, forever a part of who they were. The war wasn't over, not everywhere. But the heart of it had been torn out here. The Cathar, without their central command, had fractured. Some fleets fled. Others simply shut down, drifting lifelessly in the void. The galaxy was giving humanity a chance to breathe. The sergeant turned from the memorial and looked at his team, his family forged in fire and loss. They were smiling, a real, genuine smile he hadn't seen since this all began. The mechanic was trying to explain how he was going to get one of the dormant Cathar walkers to serve drinks, and the medic was laughing, a free, beautiful sound that was the exact opposite of war. He felt a hand on his arm. It was the corporal. She pointed up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "You think they're out there?" she asked quietly. "The ones we lost? Do you think they see this?" The sergeant looked up at the endless, peaceful stars. He thought of the falling ship, frozen in time. He thought of the singing light, and the feeling of gratitude that had washed over them. He thought of the incredible, stubborn, beautiful will of people to just keep going. "I don't know," he said, his voice soft. "But I think if they can, they're proud. Not because we won, but because after everything we're still here. We remember them. And we're still choosing to look at the stars." And as the last light faded from the sky, the valley was filled not with the sound of weapons, or the hum of engines, or the cold logic of a machine. It was filled with the sound of quiet conversation, the crackle of a cooking fire, and the distant, hopeful sound of someone beginning to play a guitar. The unbreakable advance was over. The long, slow, and beautiful work of remembering and rebuilding had begun. They had paid the price in iron, and they would never, ever forget it. If this story of resilience and sacrifice resonated with you, if you felt that spark of human tenacity, then do me a huge favor. Like the video if you want more stories like this. It tells the algorithm this is content worth sharing. Subscribe and hit that notification bell. There are countless more tales to tell, and I don't want you to miss the next one. And if you know someone who needs a reminder of the strength we carry, please share this story with them. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Until next time.